All right, round 3, let's go. So now we're going to start talking about consumer and producer surplus. This is back on continuing the review through principles of microeconomics, kind of the foundations that you need to be able to understand this course. So this one's pretty interesting because we're going to start looking at what's the difference in between what you actually pay and what you would have been willing to sell it for, or what you would have been willing to buy it for, depending on if you're a consumer or producer. Consumers buy things, producers supply things. Alrighty, so from there, let's first talk about consumer surplus. So consumer surplus is the excess of the benefit received from a good over the amount paid for it. Let's talk about what that means, right? From another one of our handy dandy graphs. Okay, so let's say that we had our good old fashioned graph right here. So in here we have our price, we have our quantity, we have our downward sloping demand curve, and our upward sloping supply curve. Now notice that if we go to the market equilibrium, much like we had just discussed in the last video, we have an equilibrium price. You know what? No, let's just call that P. All right, so we're going to have a P star, which represents the price where the market would clear, or essentially where there's an equal amount being bought as there is being sold. And then down here we have our equilibrium quantity. Okay, so we need to think about a couple things here. First is the relationship in between what people would have been willing to pay and what they actually ended up paying. So let's say that this is the coffee example, right? If we only had one coffee in the world, and let's see, what was our equilibrium? Let's say that this is, I don't know, $4. And at $4, we have 5 lattes. Well, maybe if we had one latte, only one latte in the entire world, maybe someone would be able to pay, I don't know, $10 for it. They'd be able to pay a lot, right? Like they really want that one. It's special. They want it. They're willing to pay $10 for it. So for that very first one, we might see that someone would be willing to pay $10. But they actually end up paying $4 because all the lattes cost the same amount, right? The difference in between the $4 that they end up paying and the $10 they actually pay, we call this difference consumer surplus. For the second person or the second latte, there's going to be some amount that they were willing to pay that was higher than that amount. For the third or fourth latte in the world, people still probably would have been willing to pay more than what they actually paid for it, up until we get to our equilibrium, where we get to the point where the willingness to pay of the person who buys that fifth latte is the exact same as what it costs for that latte. So this triangle that's now been created up at the top, we call this triangle consumer surplus. You probably kind of understand this idea already. It's the idea of like when you got a good deal, like you went to the store and you would have been willing to pay $20 for a sweater, but they were on sale for 10, and like you are in a good mood, things are great. Well, the collection of your feeling of consumer surplus and everybody else who bought the goods feelings of consumer surplus put together is this little extra bit of happiness for consumers, right? They're very happy with it, and this is awesome. So it's just the excess of the benefit that you receive, because you might value that first latte at $10. Like you might value it at it, and that's the benefit you receive, but that's going to be in excess of the price you actually paid for it. So what it really comes down to is the marginal benefit that you get for each additional latte minus the price. So the $10 of happiness I would have gotten from that first latte minus the $4 price, that's the $6 consumer surplus right there. Just add that up for each and every person, you get your nice triangle. All right, so hopefully you kind of understand that. It's the top half of the triangle. All righty, let's go to the next one. So from here, I end up giving you an example of Lisa and Nick that you can follow along if you want to. If the price of pizza is $1, well, we see that the two people act kind of differently. For Lisa, at $2.50, she wouldn't be willing to pay for any pizza. At $2 a slice, she might get 10 slices of pizza. At $1.50, she might get 20, or well, if it was $1.50, so it was cheaper, she might be willing to pay for 20 slices of pizza. And then at $1 a slice, maybe that's 30 slices of pizza. That's what she'd be willing to pay. So notice that this amount above the curve is sort of her consumer surplus, right? Well, for Nick, on the other hand, if it's above $1.50, he's not buying pizza. But if it's less than $1.50, for example, $1, maybe he'll buy 10 slices. So we see that he has some consumer surplus in this triangle. When we have market prices, we just add these up together. So at $2, well, who purchases at $2? At $2, we would have Lisa purchasing 20 and Nick purchasing 0. So here in the market, we would have what? Oh, no, that's 10 for Lisa. My bad. So Lisa would be buying 10. Nick would be buying 0. At $2 here, we see that 10 are bought in society. Now, what if we come all the way down at $1? Well, $1, we see that Lisa will buy 30 slices. Nick will buy 10 slices. Okay, all right. Then that means in the economy or in the market, if these are the only two people in the market, then at $1, 40 are sold. So the next one just shows you, and it colors it in green, what this consumer surplus would look like. The extra bit of happiness that they get for the pizzas that they bought. Like, yeah, I definitely paid less than what I would have been willing to pay for that first one. I got a good deal. And just adding up all of that piece for both Lisa and Nick. Oops. Where are we going? There we go. On the other side, we also have producer surplus. So that's the consumer side. Consumers are happy. They love a good deal, right? But let's think about what the producer surplus side would look like. So there's going to be some amount that you would be willing to sell a good for. Maybe for this very first latte, they need to make $2. But instead of $2, they're actually making $4, right? So yeah, someone's paying a price above what that minimum cost is. That's good. They're happy about that. What we call this here is producer surplus. This is the additional amount that you are paid above what your minimum cost would be. So if it costs $2 to make that first latte, but you get paid $4, that is $2 of producer surplus left. And this keeps going and going for each one sold. So maybe for the second latte, there'll be some producer surplus. Maybe it cost you $2.50 to make that latte, but you sell it for $4. So you get $1.50 of producer surplus. So on and so forth to maybe we get to this fourth latte. Maybe you can make that latte for like $3.50, but you end up selling it for $4. You make 50 cents of producer surplus. So on and so forth up until we get to that market equilibrium. So with that market equilibrium, that's where we know that we have gotten to the point where there's an equal amount being sold as being bought. So there's no more producer surplus to have. Producer surplus is the bottom half of the triangle, while consumer surplus is the top half of the triangle. All right. We good? We got this? I believe in you. I'm assuming that you're telling me like, yeah, I totally understand what this is. It's just for producer surplus, it's the excess amount that you receive, the price people are paying to you minus your cost of producing a good, what that amount is. And it keeps getting smaller and smaller and smaller to eventually you get to the point where you no longer have an excess. They are paying you the same amount as the cost it takes for you to make a good or service. And that's when you no longer produce. All right. So here again, I give you two people in the economy for pizza. We have Maria and Max. So maybe at $5, Maria, she can't really make pizza at $5, but once you start paying her a little bit more than that, since that's the minimum amount she needs, she'll start making pizza. Maybe at $10 for a full pizza, she might make 50 pizzas. Maybe at $15 for a full pizza, maybe she's like, you know what? I'm gonna spend a couple extra hours at work because they're paying me a lot. So maybe I will make 100 pizzas at $15. Max, on the other hand, might say, oh, okay, well, $10, that's kind of the cheapest I can make a pizza. Like my ingredient costs are a little bit different. Like maybe there's not good sources for some of these things nearby me. So I really need $10 for that first pizza. That's the minimum cost I can go to. And then as he produces more and more, that cost kind of rises, right? You got to get supplies from further away. You got to pay more in shipping. You got to do stuff like that. But maybe if you pay him $15, he'd be willing to produce 50 pizzas. Well, when we combine them together in the market, we just combine people horizontally like this. We go up at the different price points. So let's see, $10. Well, at $10, Max produces nothing. Maria produces 50. So we're going to have 50 made in the market at $10. At $15, Max enters the market. So at $15, Maria is going to produce 100. Max is going to produce 150 or 50. So that in the entire economy at $15, we get 150 pizzas made. And then what that looks like when we start to fill it in is something like this. So the blue is where the producer surplus would be. This is the extra bit of happiness or profit the producer is getting. It's the difference between what people are paying them and what it actually costs them to produce. Notice the red beneath it. So the red beneath it, that's just the cost that you have of being able to produce that pizza, right? If we produced 15 pizzas at $150, there's an amount of money that we would make for that, whatever 15 times 150 is. I should be able to do this off the top of my head, but I cannot. So 2,250. So this block right here represents $2,250, but a lot of that's going to have to go to cost. This red piece right here goes to being able to pay for the cost of the goods and services, while the blue is the additional amount the producers are making. Notice that they stop producing when we get to the point where the cost equals what the price in the economy is. All right, so here's a really good look at what it looks like when we're in equilibrium. So there's lots of things we'll do to this graph later. We might shift supply, we might shift demand, we might add a tax into it, and that'll adjust how big or small this consumer producer surplus is. But as of right now, what you need to remember is that consumer surplus is the difference in between the marginal benefit, how much I value that good, and how much I paid for it, collected over the total amount of goods that we have bought and sold. So this top triangle right here. For producer surplus, it's the minimal cost at which you can produce something, the difference between that and the price, right? So if the price is 15, this is the minimal amount that we can produce something for, then that's the additional amount of like sort of profit that you get. This producer surplus is also very important because this producer surplus is kind of a measure of how well producers are doing. All right. So I'm actually not going to break this up into two videos. We're just going to have them as one video because these are a couple like easier concepts, right? We're going to talk about what happens to this price and quantity when there's shortages and surpluses in the market, because these are two other very important pieces of our overall set. So let's first think of, let's do, I think, a shortage. Let's do a shortage. So let's start off with rent ceilings. Rent ceilings is just the idea of a price ceiling. So we're going to have two different things that we're talking about. We're going to talk about price ceilings when there's a legal maximum of how much you can charge for something, and then price floors when there's a legal minimum for what you can charge for something, right? So when a price ceiling is applied to a housing market, it's called a rent ceiling. This is just a really popular one that we tend to use in economics a lot. If the rent ceiling is above the equilibrium rent, it doesn't really matter. If it's below the equilibrium rent, though, we see that we have a shortage. What do I mean by that? Well, here, let's just go on, and I'm going to write or draw you two situations. So let's say that we have two housing markets that we want to look at. So we're going to have our quantity right here, our price up here, and then let's have maybe a slightly different market where we have our quantity right here and price right here. In both, we're going to have our downward sloping demand line and our upward sloping supply line. So this is the supply for apartments and the demand for apartments. We're going to have the same one right here. So our demand for apartments and our supply for apartments. And let's say the equilibrium quantity and price might be, let's see, having apartments for $1,000. And when they're $1,000 apartments, maybe there's 250 of them in Edwardsville. Okay, so let's do this on the other side as well. Let's say that we have an equilibrium. We're at $1,000. We have just as many apartments being supplied as we have people wanting those apartments. Oops. Where's the... Okay. I changed tablets recently and I can't figure out how to do the eraser on it. Let's say 250 apartments. Okay, well, there's two different situations we can have. We can have a rent ceiling or price ceiling that's binding, or we can have one that's not binding. So let's first start off with the not binding example. If we're at a point where the market already is selling apartments for about $1,000 a month, but then the government comes in and they say, okay, actually we need some controls here. We need some price controls. What we're going to have is we're going to put in a rent ceiling. Ooh, imagine that that's a straight line. Rent ceiling of $1,200. You cannot charge your tenants more than $1,200. Well, that doesn't really matter, right? The apartments are already going for $1,000. If you tell me that I can't charge people more than $1,200, well, I'm already charging them less than that. That's a non-binding case. Nothing happens in that situation. On the other side, we have a binding price ceiling. So let's say that instead we have the government comes in and they have a new rule. And this new rule is, let's have this as ceiling, that your new apartment or the apartment that you want to rent out cannot cost people more than $800. Okay, I was renting out my apartments for $1,000. Now I have to rent them out for $800. What am I going to do? Well, let's figure that out. Well, what would the supplier do if we look at the supply line? Well, our new quantity supplied, the amount that suppliers would be willing to supply kind of goes down, right? There might be some people who say, you know what, maybe I'll make this a shopping area, or maybe I'll rent out this area to a gym, or maybe I'll just live in this dwelling myself and not rent it out. So we might have a reduction in the quantity supplied. But if the price for apartments goes from $1,000 to $800, well, what about the people who are demanding apartments? The people who want to move into apartments? Apartments just got $200 cheaper. They're excited. Their quantity demanded would actually be much higher. So here, quantity demanded, because there's going to be more people in the market who may not have been able to afford an $1,000 apartment, but certainly can an $800 apartment. So if we see that the quantity demand goes up and the quantity supply goes down, well, then there's a little bit of a mismatch here. So let's say that all this area, this piece in between, this is called a shortage. It's the amount of apartments we might be short of. Let's say if suppliers were willing to provide 200 apartments, but people, now that these apartments are cheaper, we now have 300 potential renters wanting apartments, then that 300 minus 200 might mean that we have a 100 apartment shortage. All right, so what do you see in that case? Well, you might say, okay, well, this is really good for the people who got to keep apartments, but we have to think about the next part of the economic system. So at $800, well, let's bring this up to the demand line. Okay, for this amount of apartments, if we have 200 apartments, well, if we have 200 apartments, people would be willing to supply them for $800, but what people would be willing to pay might be much more than that. Let's say it's maybe like $1,600. Okay, well, what does this difference in between supply and demand represents? It represents that you might be getting an $800 apartment, but now you have to drive twice as far to be able to find the apartment, right? You're going to have to apply to more apartments and pay for the rental application and more apartments. So instead of $800, it's now like $200 in application fees, an extra $50 in gas, maybe a bunch more money bribing someone to let you live in their apartment, or saying like, hey, we'll pay you $800, but then also like, you know, I hear you want to go camping. You can borrow my camper. There's lots of different things that you can do to try to get an apartment, right? This right here represents either an increased search cost, the fact that you're paying for an $800 apartment, but your cost of finding that apartment might be closer to $1,600 in total with the apartment and the search. It can also be a sign of black market activity. When you have a shortage of apartments, then the people who could afford $1,600 apartments and value it at $1,600 might be willing to participate in black markets or an illicit means. So these are things that we have to think about when we're talking about rent ceilings. Is it a binding rent ceiling? Is the price going to be lower than what the equilibrium price is, and then we might see shortages or the rise of black markets? Or is it not binding? Is this a rule that just doesn't really matter at all? Like, it exists, but it doesn't really influence the market? Well, that's kind of the interesting part when we're thinking about rent ceilings. So housing shortage, increased search activity, black market. All right, so I also give you that right here in case you need it in the slides. Hopefully you've realized that like above all these lecture videos is where the slide is posted, but you can download all of them and be able to get them. I leave you additional examples in there so that you're able to follow along, but I think it's kind of nice to at least be able to see them drawn out and explained as we go. So with a binding rates or rent ceiling, the quantity of housing demanded exceeds the quantity of housing supplied. Remember, that's what I said earlier about like 300 people would want apartments, but only 200 apartments are there. That means that there's a shortage, and because of shortage, we might see other mechanisms happening, such as it takes longer to find an apartment, you might have to pay more to apply for more apartments, and black markets might exist. Oh, okay. So with that, we see that we might have a deadweight loss that exists. So let's actually overlay that on top of what we've already done. Notice that when we talk about the amount after search activity in black markets that we have that consumers really actually face, and the difference between the $800 that they pay for the apartment, well, let's see what happens. Notice that we have a triangle that appears right here. This is the first piece of the puzzle. This is called deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is a concept of having less producer and consumer surplus, right? So less producer and consumer surplus. Deadweight loss just means there are trades that are no longer happening that would have happened if the market did not have this regulation on it. So we would have had this 249th apartment being rented out, or the 250th apartment being rented out, instead of having only 200 apartments. There were 50 other apartments that would have been rented out if we were allowed to manipulate the prices up to the market equilibrium, but instead we're kept artificially low. Okay, then remember that consumer surplus was the top half of that triangle. Well, notice we have another triangle that's created right here. We have the price that people actually kind of pay after the search activity and the amount they would be willing to pay that's on our demand line, right? So the difference between what they'd be willing to pay and what they actually paid, remember that's our consumer surplus. So right here, oh gosh, I'm sorry. This is becoming a very crowded area, but this is consumer surplus. Notice it's much smaller. In the non-binding area right here, our consumer surplus is this entire top half of the triangle. Now it's much smaller. That's because we lose a lot to potential loss from the housing search. This, here, we'll put polka dots in it. This rectangle right here, this rectangle represents some of that potential loss from the housing search. This represents all the extra gas, all the extra time, all the extra days off work to apply for apartments and to find an apartment, so on and so forth. That's going to be just losses. All right, then we have the bottom half. So remember, in our non-binding system, this piece right here, this is our producer surplus. It's the extra bit of happiness producers get because it's the difference between what they're paid and what they would have been willing to provide it for. Here we see the $800 that they're paid, but the amount that they'd be willing to provide it for is much, much smaller. This is also a smaller triangle. Producer surplus. So in this, with a binding rent ceiling, we see that there's a shortage of houses. The people who do manage to get one do pay $800, but they also pay a lot of other costs associated with it that actually make it more expensive than if they were the $1,000 apartments. And that's the increased cost of travel, the increased cost of everything else. Producers also have less surplus because now they're only making 800 when before they would have made 1,000. So they're going to provide less apartments and there's going to be less producer surplus over those additional apartments. So that's a lot of what we're looking at on that one, and which I also have described here in a nice pretty graph for you if you do not like my handwriting, because I totally understand. Another one that we have is the idea of a price floor. So when we talk about price floors, a really popular way to think about this is minimum wage, and that's typically the one that economists will use when we're explaining it. So a price floor, okay, so price ceilings made it so there was a maximum amount that you could charge. A price floor means that there is a minimum amount that you can charge. In this, we're going to be looking at the market for labor. So it's people who are demanding workers to hire. So the market's for workers, the people who are demanding to hire the workers, and the workers who are supplying their labor. That's what we're going to be seeing in here. And you have to think about a price floor. So if we could pay workers anything, we might get to a wage that's below an existence to live, right? So we also have this idea of a minimum wage, which is a price floor, saying like there's an amount you cannot pay them lower than. So we have to think about if the minimum wage is set below or above what the equilibrium wage would have been. So here, we'll just keep going down. We're going to have the same two individual setups again, where we look at a binding and a not binding example. So let's say that we have, and this is going to be for price floors. We have our two picture perfect areas that we're going to be looking at, and we're going to have one that is non-binding and one that is binding. For both of these, we're going to have our price, our quantity, price, quantity, our downward sloping demand line, our upward sloping supply line, downward sloping demand line, upward sloping supply line. So let's say in this case, what we get to, let's say that the equilibrium wage, what people are really getting paid when we think about it, like what that equilibrium wage is, let's say maybe it's $12. And at $12, we have 1,000 people who have been hired. So let's have this in both of our two situations. So $12, 1,000 workers hired. So remember that this is a price floor for labor, markets for labor. Okay. So in our non-binding case, let's say that people are making $12. The government comes in and they put in a new rule and they say, we've raised the minimum wage. You cannot pay people less than $9. Oh, that doesn't really matter, right? If we put in a rule that says you can't pay them less than $9, they were already making 12. So in this case, we have this top part of the triangle, which is going to be the consumer surplus. In this case, it's firms who demand labor. And at the bottom, we have producer surplus. So the people who provide the labor. In this case, workers. Okay, so that's the non-binding case. Doesn't really matter. Things do not get affected. Let's think about the binding case, though. Let's say that a new rule comes in for a $15 minimum wage. We've seen stuff about this all the time, and it's something that's been debated and in some places even implemented. Let's say that there's a $15 minimum wage. Well, what happens if you cannot charge people less than $15 for each hour of labor? Okay. Well, okay, this is the binding case. Let's look at the supply. So the amount of people who want to work. Well, if you increase wages to $15, you're going to have some additional people who want to supply their labor. The quantity supplied is going to increase, right? Let's say that maybe we now have 1,200 people who want to work. They're like, yeah, I wasn't willing to work at 1,200, but like I'll work at 15, or I wouldn't work at $12, but now I'll work at 15. All right. Then we have to look at the demand for hiring these workers. Well, now it costs a little bit more. Maybe some companies are not really going to be willing to do it because they're like, I don't know if I want to pay that much for workers. So maybe they choose to hire slightly less. So their quantity demand is actually going to be, let's say 800, right? So maybe there's actually now only jobs for 800 workers. Well, if there are 800 jobs available, but 1,200 workers who need work, then what we call this is a surplus, where there's more things being provided than people who are willing or people who are willing to purchase it. So this is 1,200 workers who want to work minus 800 jobs. That means that there's a surplus of 400 workers, right? Yeah. Alrighty, well, let's see. Is there anything else you need to think about on this? Well, let's see what happens with consumer and producer surplus. So again, notice that we have a triangle that's created right here. Well, what does that necessarily mean? Okay, well, workers are making 1,500. Oops, they're making 1,500, but maybe, or $15. I cannot talk today. I apologize so much. Anyways, let's say they're making $15. Well, now because there's less jobs, maybe it costs them an extra $3 in gas, right? And then maybe it takes a little bit longer unemployed to find a job. So that really at the end of the day, what they kind of keep in their pocket might be closer to like $10 after they pay for all these additional costs. Well, in this, we see this triangle has been created. Remember, this is our deadweight loss triangle. These are the trades that are no longer happening that might have happened. It's hiring that 900th worker or that 950th worker. We no longer see that happening. We have deadweight loss. Deadweight loss. All right. Notice that we also have a smaller consumer surplus triangle. This piece in between the $15 that these companies are paying versus how much they would have valued that labor at. Smaller amount of consumer surplus. Then we have down here, after all the search costs and the additional amount they have to pay in gas to go to work and stuff like that, the extra $10 that people are actually keeping in their wallets at the end of this. Well, that producer surplus, the difference in between what they would have been willing to work at and the $10 that they got, that's also smaller too. And then we have this rectangle in the middle. And this is just losses related to the search activity, losses related to having to search for a job longer, losses related to having to compete for those jobs, losses related to having to pay more in gas to get to new jobs that are further away, so on and so forth. So notice that these two look very different and very similar at the same time. Shortage just means that we have more being supplied than what is actually being purchased, right? Or excuse me, more being demanded than what is actually supplied. While when it comes to surplus, there is more being supplied than what is being demanded by the market. So in both of these, we have a non-binding and a binding case. Non-binding just means it doesn't really matter. The market operates the same way it would have beforehand. While binding means, okay, we have seen some differences that relate to this policy. So again, in this one, I give you some nice graphs in case you want to look at it and kind of like go through this information. I again also give you another graph in case my handwriting is terrible, where you can see the deadweight loss, the firm surplus, which is considered just our consumer surplus, the worker surplus, which is our producer surplus, and the potential loss from the job search activities, all that extra amount of money that you're spending getting the job to begin with. So we did a lot of things this week, right? So we defined some of the basic managerial economics ideas. We reviewed a lot of the early principles of microeconomics, because I know it's been years since you maybe looked at this stuff. We looked at supply, demand, market equilibrium, consumer and producer surplus, shortages and surpluses. Next week, what we're going to do is we're going to start moving to elasticity and consumer behavior. So this is when we're going to start looking at how people react to price changes and how we can put that in a way that we can calculate and compare across different types of products or services. With that, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Remember that we have a discussion post, an assignment, and a quiz that comes along with every single week. So be sure to go back and do that as well. All righty, you have a great one. If you need anything, you feel free to email me. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.